Hey everybody, Omar here, your knife of the party, and I am back with a new fun-filled video for you. And today we're going to be going over my South African custom collection. This is basically just a video on why custom knives, why go to this length in this sort of hobby to find some sort of inspiration. I mean, they're just knives, but then again, there's a reason for it. There's a reason why, we have collections. There's a reason why, we're into this. We have this passionate feeling about what we love. And I have chosen South African knives as my subject to express what I love about, I guess, cutlery in general. And it's really all about, I guess, the materials in a sense. So just to make things a little bit interesting to understand why. You guys are familiar with this knife. This is the ZT0562. Now, this is probably one of the best production knives out there. Anybody that's owned this knife, it's a fantastic user piece. I love it. I've always used it. Mine's used. But you're kind of limited to mostly, aesthetically, you're not really given a lot. Most of the time, as well built as these knives are, they don't really offer you anything in the way of, I'm going to say, I guess, inspiration or whatever you want to call it, as far as that would make the knife interesting. In fact, a lot of the things on this knife were actually put on here just to give it a little bit more of an aesthetic, but there's no story behind it. There's no real understanding of how the knife was put together or why the knife was put together. It's just not there. This is basically a production model. The knife is, basically put together by quite a few skilled people on an assembly line that put this knife together. And it's mostly seen as a tool. As you guys can see, they put aesthetics on there to make it more interesting. And of course, it runs on ball bearings, so there's another attraction to it. That would basically, that's all there is to this piece, but it's still a fantastic knife. It's still a great knife, and it's still a great tool, but it doesn't go beyond that. Take a look at another knife here. This is the Kershaw bare knuckle knife. Here's another one. Now, this one's got a little bit more on it. Unlike the 0562, there was only one slab of carbon fiber on it, right? You've got some fancy looking screws, regular plain old titanium pocket clip with that. Other than that, nothing special. So now here we jump ahead into the Kershaw bare knuckle knife. This one now is all black wash, M390. We've got carbon fiber on both sides, so that makes it a little bit more into like the custom territory where now they're giving you a little bit more, so that's nice. But still, the action is really, really good for what it is. It does run on ball bearings, so you're satisfied with, what you have in front of you, but you kind of begin to question, can there be more? So now, having said that, we're going to get into my collection. What I have here in front of me is just a small sample size. And the reason for this video is to pretty much explain what will happen to you if you go down this road. And I assume what's happening here would happen even if it wasn't just all South African knives. Let's say you had Russian and some English knives and whatever. Each knife that you buy is going to evolve. And the reason that it evolves is because you're learning more and more about your hobby. So let me get right into this. This is the very first custom I ever bought. This is John Arnold knife. This one is a front flipper. So that was my first attraction. I had never ever seen a front flipper before. If you look at both of these really awesome production knives, neither one of these are front flippers. They're just regular flippers where the flipper's on the side. So already I'm starting to grow a little bit as a knife collector by choosing a front flipper. I actually had to learn how to flip this thing because I really just did not understand how. In fact, the first time I ever flipped this knife, I think it almost flew out of my hand. So it was something that, it was a thing for me to learn, a thing for me to understand as far as the deployment of the knife. That was new. That was new. So even on this particular knife, I was already starting to get intrigued by what was on it. Now, this knife material is mostly G10, but it has some Ambonia wood burl inlays in it. So the combination of G10, now a lot of people may not know this, but G10 is almost an indestructible material. It's mostly made up of like fiberglass and epoxy resin, and basically it's molded into this durable material. So what makes this custom so interesting, and this is what I've learned as I got it, was that we have a natural material like wood mixed in with an unnatural material like G10. So I kind of like that kind of combination. At the time I was learning, I thought, okay, so G10 and wood together really go good on a knife. So I thought that that was where I was going to go with my collection, that maybe I'll have a bunch of knives with a combination of materials on them, natural and unnatural. And so this is a perfect example of the first custom that I got and what I learned. Then we moved on to my Andre Thorburn Custom 38. Again, you can see I'm evolving now, in a sense that what we have here now is white Westinghouse material on here. So I go from having natural and unnatural materials into something that's a little bit more elaborate. Still an unnatural material. I mean, white Westinghouse is not an organic material. This is basically refrigerator material. But the beauty of it is the way that it was well done. You know, white Westinghouse, I mean, the way the knife looks, it looks like basically a bird slammed onto the knife. I've said that before. You know, you've got the engraving of the eagle on it. You're just not going to find stuff like this on production knives. So you now are beginning to understand that while this is a tool, right, a tool can be made to be art. And the plethora of materials that you're going to find on these knives, each time you get a knife, there's going to be some kind of weird material on it, and it's going to elevate your thinking as far as what kind of a collector you are now, what kind of collector you were before, and what kind of a collector you're going to be in the future. Because with each new material that's on a knife, that's something that you learn. That's something that has now changed your outlook on this hobby, which is probably one of the main reasons why I chose South African knives, is because it's just going to continue to keep growing and growing and growing. Moving on to the next one. Now, if you look at both these knives, they're almost practically similar. However, there is a big difference. This is G10, which is that unnatural material, epoxy resin and fiberglass. So now I've stopped collecting that at this point. Now I'm going for more organic materials. We've got sort of, and the way that the knife is built is much more complex. Believe it or not, it looks like, I mean, I have no idea whether this knife is actually, you know, all one piece or not. I'm assuming it's not, because the outline is all carbon fiber, and this wood here is called snake wood. So we've got two materials together, slightly elevated, even though carbon fiber is not really an organic material. It's more of a natural inorganic material, in a sense that the material is not a mixture of, like, for example, on this knife, it's not a mixture of epoxy resin and fiberglass. It's just carbon fiber. It's still an unnatural material, but it's one type of material. So the combination of the wood and the marble and the carbon fiber together really, I thought, made an amazing combination. And then when you look on the back of the knife, there's a third material now, versus on the old knife where I just had a regular old purple titanium pocket clip. Now I've elevated a little bit. I've got a zirconium pocket clip. That's another material that I picked up in my, in this adventure, where I didn't even know what zirconium was, and now it's on my knife and I've learned about it. And I'm beginning to understand what the material is that's on my knife and why it's important to have it on there. So that's all part of the adventure when you're collecting. This one here, this is my Arucus Plumeris I believe it's LL51 flipper. This one was very, very important in my collection. It's my very first full truss piece. Again, something new. I had no idea what a full truss piece was, but basically a full truss piece is a knife where every part of the knife has some kind of art on it. So now you guys can see when you're getting into custom knives, you're now moving away from the aspect of the knife just being a tool. It's no longer just a tool. Now we're getting into a little bit more of the art aspect. So on this knife, I learned about Damascus, and then the the black marble carbon fiber, and then of course it has Damascus. But you can already see this only being like my fourth knife in my collection at the time, where I've evolved. I mean, this was just, I just picked this one up by chance, not knowing anything. I saw it aesthetically, it was pleasing, so I bought it. That's it. By the time I come to this deal, I've already learned about the materials that were on these knives. And I've now evolved trying to understand what is, what comes next. What is it that I like that will come next on my knife? And so the evolution of the materials, now we've got file work on the back of the knife, something that was not really present all that much. Well, I mean, it's present on obviously my Andre Thorburn, but this was something else that I figured out, that now we've got some file work on the back of the knife. That's something that was interesting that I didn't know. So now this has now become part of my psyche when I buy knives. Like what kind of fantastic artwork could be on it that I've never seen before. And the file work really does catch your eye, because you're just not going to see this on production knives. So it's just not something you're ever going to see. And then we move on to the next knife that I got. I realized by this point there's a lot of combination of materials on a lot of these knives, which make the knife nice. But then I kind of tone it down a little bit on my fifth custom here with the Willem Steenkamp. One material, all marble carbon fiber, underneath all titanium. And that's it. And I began to realize that this is still every bit of a fantastic piece of art as this knife, except this is a little bit more, economized, in the sense that you don't have a lot of materials on here, but but the one material that you have on here really dresses it up and really makes that much of a statement as what's on this knife, where there's like a lot of colors and a lot of bling and everything. But the bling on this knife is just as much as the bling on this knife, but it was done differently with just all one material. So I had to, I started to realize how many different combinations of materials can be put on a knife, and yet still be considered a tool. Moving on, now I'm starting to evolve a little bit more as a knife maker. I'm starting to learn more. So now you're going to see my knives begin to change, in a sense that nothing on these knives are ever going to be, they're ever going to be plain. In other words, I've come to this point in my knife collecting. I could never ever go back to this, in a sense that if you look very closely on this table, you no longer see G10 on my knives anymore. It's just a material that I came across one time. I really like it. Aesthetically, it's pleasing, but I wanted more. So I began to move on to more natural, more organic, more meaningful materials that are much more interesting. As far as it being put on a knife. So on my John Arnold Mufata, the big thing about this knife, as far as me evolving as collector, is the way it looks. This is one fat knife. I mean, I've never seen a knife that looks like this, where it's all fat and wide, and the blade is kind of fat and wide. It's just something new. So that aesthetically had to grab me. Plus the fact that now I have a hand as a knife collector. I actually now had a hand in the making of this knife, in a sense that I told John Arnold I wanted to have a black and white tuxedo knife, and of course also some sort of like symbol. So now when you look at this knife, we've got sort of a yin-yang feature going on here, where it's all white, all black. We've got a gold screw, and then we've got a black screw, sort of that yin-yang thing. That was like my contribution to my own knife. So now I'm starting to do that on my own knives, where all the education that I've come across in these knives up here in the top of my collection have now given me a little bit of education to the point where, you know what, well, I want to have my knife built a certain way, and then have the knife maker make it and agree. He said that this was actually the nicest one he's ever made. And, you know, it's because I allowed myself to learn what's on my knife, to learn about the materials that make up the knife. And there's more to that. I mean, you start to understand how much money these materials cost and what's going to cost and how it should be put together. You know, whether, you know, the material is resistant to whatever forces of nature, rain, water, whatever. That all now becomes a part of your education as a custom knife collector. And I don't think that this is going to be put more on any other type of knife than a South African knife, because South Africa uses just about anything, any durable material to be put on their knives to create a tool. And that's why this entire hobby is considered an art form. So now we move on to my Clyde Challenor Raptor. This one is a huge sucker, and this is also a game changer in my collection, in a sense that all the knives up here on the top, and this one, and all the ones that I haven't talked about quite a bit. This knife is completely different in the way it's constructed. What we have here is what we call a half and half. This knife was made by machine, just like the 00562, right? However, with one slight difference. All the detail work on the knife is done by hand, by the knife maker himself. The knife maker we're talking about is Clyde Challenor. So now I've gone into this. I've discovered, I thought that all custom knives had to be made by hand, or they're not really considered a custom. That's not true. This knife broke the mold. This one is made by CNC machining. In other words, the basics of the knife, the shaping of the knife, and everything is done by CNC machines. So they actually cut the time in half using machines. However, things are slowed down quite a bit on the knife when we get to the detail, the pattern on the knife. On both sides of that was done completely by hand. Well, at least not by hand, but I mean, it was overseen completely by hand. And all the detail work, the hand detail work on the pattern, the design of it done by Clyde Challenor, was done completely by hand. He had to come up with the design for it, and then put it onto the knife. Now you have to keep this in mind. Once the knife is done with the basics, the shaping of the knife and the pattern put on there, there's still a lot of work to be put onto the knife. In other words, the polishing of the knife, the how perfect the knife is, the shape of it, everything, including the screws. If you look very closely here, this is where we start to get the hand detail work. You can see that the cross screws have some sort of shimmer on it. That's done by hand by Clyde Challenor. There's sort of a little strikes in between the crosses there, giving it that sheen. He did that, and he did that for like all 50 of these knives by hand. So again, the by hand concept never really goes away. It just kind of what Clyde Challenor tried to do with his knives is to try to show that CNC machine and detail work by hand can still produce an amazing piece, that they don't all have to be made by hand. He pretty much broke the mold on that, trying to introduce that concept where you can make the knife by machine and then do all the detail work by hand. Moving on to this next knife here, this one was really a wonder to me. If you look at all the knives on this table, a majority of these knives have ball bearings in them. Steel ball bearings in them or ceramic ball bearings in them, which allows the knife to sort of fall shut like that. I came across this one. This is the Deshorn Mvubu. And what's interesting about this knife is I always felt that this should have been my first custom. Just because of the way that it's made. There's no ball bearings in this. But, I mean, if you look at how this knife, it falls shut just as well as say, a ball bearing knife like my Clyde Challenger Raptor. Right? I mean, I go back to this knife here. I mean, this made it the wonder. This is the reason why I had to have the knife. That this knife kind of broke the mold in a sense that all the complexity above here with all these other knives, with the materials, and something gets lost in all the bling. And so now my next knife wound up being, well, let me kind of tone it down a bit and let me experience something else. So I got my Deshorn Mvubu, which basically means hippopotamus. That's what the knife means. It's a big knife. But at the same time, it's also a light knife. You know, we've got carbon fiber scales on here. We've got the jeweled screws on there, which look absolutely fantastic. We've got a blue titanium pot clip, and yet it's still a simple knife. It's not as complex as, say, my John Arnold Mufata. So this makes just as much of a statement as this one. And the best part about this knife is that you learn that the knives don't always have to go in a direction of complex. You don't have to keep piling on layers and layers of materials in order to make a knife interesting. Sometimes a knife can just be simple. One or two materials and maybe not even have ball bearings in it. So here's another example where a knife maker goes in another direction to give you a different experience. So now as you go through this hobby, each knife that you get, you become a different collector every time you get a new knife. And that's what makes this hobby so fun, is that you have no idea what you're going to come across in the future, but you know it's going to change you as a collector. Who knows what's going to happen at the end of my collection when I'm done with all this, whenever that will be. So moving on now, the materials are becoming more and more complex. The design of the knife is becoming more and more complex, and nothing is more complex than this knife here. This is my Deshorn ball release, another one that does not run on ball bearings. It's simple, just washers. But we have a new mechanism on the knife. Right? So this is the first time in my knife collection that you're seeing a new way of opening and closing a knife. Something you're not going to get if you stick with the production models. Production models are great. They're great tools, and they'll come out with new and interesting materials. And that will probably, you know, feed the beast for a while if you want to stay in that direction. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, nobody says you have to go into this complexity of collecting if you don't want to. You can stay here and be just as satisfied with, say, getting a really great production knife that's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. But that being said, we now have another knife here that the materials become complex, but not only the materials are becoming more and more complex, now the building of the knife is becoming a little bit more complex than it used to be. If we take a good close look at this knife, like this knife, we've got carbon fiber on it, and it's kind of shimmering. This is done sort of all naturally, right? But now we've got Deshorn taking the carbon fiber and putting this sort of shimmery sheen in it. And if you look in the light, it almost looks like it's 3D. See the carbon fiber in the knife? You feel like you can almost reach inside that glass shimmering thing and feel the carbon fiber in there. And it gives it that sort of like different design look on it. So the way he does this to make the knife kind of shimmering like that, it's a process called K2 gloss spray, and he sprays it on the knife, and it's not an easy process, because if you don't do it correctly, the K2 gloss could completely screw up the knife, and then you'd have to start all over again. Deshorn became a master at Deshorn becomes a master at that by keeping it all, nice and, shimmering, because it actually takes skill to get it to look like this. So that's another thing that you learn, all the hard work that these knife makers put into making this an art piece. You really have to learn to appreciate it. So now we see a I have now evolved in a sense that if we go back to, say, this knife, where the pivot was just the same old pivot that regular production models use, right? I mean, if you take a look at my 0562, you know, this is sort of like a custom screw, but the screw that actually comes with this knife is actually what you see here. So now I go to my Des Horn knife. Now I've got these jeweled screws, these engraved screws. So now that's another elevation in it. You know what I mean? You start to learn. I mean, look at these little, they look like pieces of jewelry, and they're really just screws. That's part of all the learning process. Again, we've got more intricate file work, even more intricate than, say, the rope file work that's on my Rugus Lumeris. I mean, I saw that and I had to have it. So with each knife, things evolve. You're learning new things. This is also the first knife that doesn't have a pocket clip on it. This one came with a nice leather slip, and it was the first time I realized that not all knives have to have pocket clips on them. We've now got another full dress piece with the Swedish steel Damascus on the blade there. And of course the Damascus backspacer as well. But the ball release is what makes it such a great piece. I mean, the fact that we have a new mechanism, because you basically, the way it works is you open the knife, you open it like regular, and then to close it, you press the ball, and then the knife will close. There is a way to open and close it by pressing the button and then closing it. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to hit my iPhone. But, you know, it's another mechanism. It's something new on a knife that I had to learn and that I wasn't really even aware even existed. So the ball release. And, of course, this is sort of like a fancier version of like the button lock that you would get on some of the knives. You know, say like on the Civivi Elementum, they've got a button lock. Works kind of the same way, but this one's a little bit more manually done, because on the Elementum, you can actually press the button, close the knife, press the button, open the knife. That's not the case here. The only thing you can do with this is just press the button and close the knife. So it's more of a manual closing, but again, it's an interesting mechanism, and I had to have it on my knife. So now I've got the way a knife opens and closes as part of my education on the next custom that I get. So this one isn't really something that I picked up new, but it's a new type of material again. You know, there was blue Damascus on this knife, and now we see that same theme come back at me on this one. But now, instead of having just a titanium pocket clip, now I've got a Damascus pocket clip. So I wanted to take the concept of having Damascus on my knife and make it actually the pocket. I didn't know you could make Damascus into a pocket clip. That was another thing that I learned. And of course, the knife is just absolutely spectacular. Now, we've also got Damascus for the backspacer. That's the first time I ever had that on a knife, where the backspacer is now made of Damascus. So you begin to evolve as a knife collector. You're going to have more and more new and interesting knives with new materials you probably never even heard of, and it's all part of the journey. This is what makes this type of knife collecting fun. This is why I got into South African knife collecting, because the types of materials that people use in South Africa are organic, inorganic. I mean, there are knives out there with like whalebone and shark's teeth. I haven't ventured off into that quite just yet, but I have a funny feeling that I will begin to as I get into this hobby more and more. So I just wanted to give you guys a little idea as to why I got into knife collecting and why custom knives and why South African custom knives. So to conclude, the reason I got into this hobby is because of the how well built all the knives are, but also the plethora of materials that they put onto the knife and still come out consistent with the great quality that you would expect on a knife made by hand. It's just a different way of looking at a tool But now the tool is more of an art form. In fact, I would have to say, when you get to this level of knife collecting, at some point in knife collecting, where you're going to get to a point where you're going to stop looking at it like it's a tool, and you're just going to look at it like a sculpture or a piece of artwork. It becomes more and more predominant as the collection begins to evolve. Not that the tool part's ever going to go away, but yeah, I would have to say that the way that the knife is put together, the materials that the knife makers put onto the knife, plus their own contributions as knife makers to make the art piece or the knife more interesting to the buyer, the concept of the word tool gets lost. But that's not to say that you can't just pick up this knife and use it to open up a box, because that's basically what it's for, cutting. But what these knife makers do is they make the idea of cutting and using a tool much more interesting when you put it in your hand and you see all the bling and you see how well put together the knife is, and the thought process that went into creating such a beautiful piece of artwork. So this is Omar, your Knife of the Party guy, signing off, giving you guys a little idea of why custom knives, and I hope this video was interesting to you. Please, if you like this video, comment on it. Let me know what you think. Did you find anything interesting in what I talked about? Because that's what this hobby is all about. It's all about sharing and learning, and I hope I shared something with you guys today. Again, thank you so much for watching, and you guys have a fantastic Saturday evening.